When we talk about modern slavery, many of us imagine it as a distant issue. Why is it important to understand it is a systemic problem?
Yeah, it is. It's important to say modern day slavery, I think, because the systems that hold slavery up in its current forms are relatively new systems. Or maybe people will have different points of view on this because even the earlier forms of slavery were predicated on colonialism and capitalism, right? The one thing that we know now and that we can't shirk from is that modern crises are feeding into this, right?
Could you share some example where clustered investments have led to shifts either in policies or practices?
Yeah, again, the problem with this is that there are so many. But let me maybe share an example from, let's say, Brazil, where the commercial sexual exploitation of girls is just rife in the northeast of Brazil, in Recife, where we have a hotspot. So started the intervention there about 5 years ago. We've invested systematically in about 10 partners over the last 5 or 6 years. 1 in 6 girls in Recife has had transactional sex before the age of 17, at least once. That's a staggering figure. And recently, they've the state of Pernambuco, which is the where Recife is located, that state has passed a 10-year action plan for the prevention of sexual violence against children and adolescents.
Is there one takeaway that you want to leave here for the audience to end modern day slavery? Today, we are joined by Havovi Wadia, a powerful voice in the fight against modern slavery. With over 2 decades in child rights, education, and social development, Havovi now leads programs at the Freedom Fund, a global initiative tackling forced labor, trafficking, and exploitation. They say slavery does not end when the chains are removed, it ends when the system that allowed it to exist is dismantled. Havovi, thank you for agreeing to speak on the topic of ending modern slavery. I'm so happy that you have taken time out and joined me in this conversation, different time zones as well.
I'm very happy to be here, Santosh, and I'm really happy to answer any questions about this and anything else that we talk about today.
Thank you so much. The first question, obviously, is that you spend a long time in the sector. What drew you to the sector in the first place?
I started out being a teacher. I was teaching in various colleges in Mumbai and in Pune. And at some point, I saw a JD, and I was overseas. I came back and I saw a JD, and that's what drew me to the sector. This JD that somebody took the time to write and make exciting, and then somebody spent the time to explain it to me. And then at the interview, I had two really engaged, really intelligent people ask me some phenomenal questions, and that is what has drawn me to the sector, and that's what's kept me here. That there are always people who are willing to engage, that there is a real quest for justice, that the diversity of people in the sector is extraordinary. There's always space for dialogue and conversation. There's always space for debate. It's a very alive, it feels always that there is movement in it, and so you always live in hope. And I think that that's what drew me to the sector, and that's what keeps me in the sector. We often say, right, that we come to the sector because of the mission, like we want an equal world, we want justice for everyone. But I very strongly believe that it's about people. It's about the people in the sector. They are the ones who pull other people in, and that's why we're all here. It's about that, even more than, I think, even more than the things that, the values or the thing that we're moving towards.
And do you see that across geographies as well? Because you worked in India and now you are in the UK.
Yeah, I do. And I'll say that when I first came to the UK, I felt I felt terrible because I just felt that so many people here just don't know the depth of the talent in India. And I'd worked in India 15, 16 years in the sector. I feel like the number of people I didn't work with, but whom I found inspiring and engaging, it's just countless, right? And I was stunned at the way almost some conversations about the sector happen here. So I'll just say that to start with. But yes, across, I think across geographies, not just the UK and in India, right? But I work with colleagues in Kenya and in Ethiopia and in Brazil and in Indonesia, and everywhere it's that incredibly passionate human beings from different backgrounds just bringing this real conviction together and building relationships, and those relationships really are then what enables you to do the work that you have to do. If nothing's going to happen with you without the relationships. So yeah, I would say it applies everywhere.
Yeah. So, can you tell me a bit about the work that you do at Freedom Fund right now?
So the organization's purpose is to end modern slavery, and the way we do it is by funding, convening, and supporting frontline partners. So what we do is we identify where a modern slavery, a particular form of modern slavery exists, and through research and engagement with local stakeholders, we identify what we call a hotspot, which is a sub-national area in which there's a very high prevalence of that form of slavery. And then our model is that we understand that the problem can't be solved. These are very complicated problems, and so they can't be solved usually by just one kind of solution. So we convene a whole set of partners, each of whom brings their specialization to the problem, and we invest in them over a long term period. So that's a clustered long term investment, and over a period of time, all these people are doing what they specialize in, but together they're able to create impact which is greater than the sum of their parts, really. So there's direct impact, but also then we're able to, because it's a collaborative, then to leverage their impact with systems, right? So whether that's corporations or leverage that with government policy, so that the impact of what you're doing is those you directly reach, but then also a far greater number over a period of time. And that's the core work of the organization. It's really, if there was one thing that the Freedom Fund had to keep doing forever, this is the work that we would do. This is the work we believe in, very strongly. But it's supported by two other pillars of work, which I think are, they may not be as large as this central investment of ours, but they're extremely important. One is just creating an evidence base, right? Because
Right.
a lot of people say things like, well, there just isn't data. And when the Freedom Fund was launched in 2014, it's possible that we didn't have as much data as we have today. But today, we have written or published over 26 prevalence studies, so that there's hard numbers on prevalence of slavery in certain, geographies. And then, of course, there's this massive set of data that Walk Free looks at every 5 years, called the Global Estimates on Modern Slavery or the Global Slavery Index. So now there is a lot more data. But contributing to the evidence base is a very large part of our work. So our research team is very important. And then the last, pillar for us really is what we call responsible supply chains. And I know that this is also something many people are interested in. How does business contribute to this, right? Contribute to the problem, but then also contribute to the solutions. And in our responsible supply chains work, we very strategically use campaigns, investigations, reports to hold organized corporations accountable and responsible. Sorry, it's a long answer.
Oh, that's absolutely okay. But when we talk about modern slavery, many of us imagine it as a distant issue. Why is it important to understand it is a systemic problem?
Yeah, it is. That I just learned so much about this in the last 5 years or so. It's important to say modern day slavery, I think, because the systems that hold slavery up in its current forms are really, I think, n- relatively new systems. Or maybe people will have different points of view on this, because even the earlier forms of slavery were predicated on colonialism and capitalism, right? And those, in a sense, you have neo-colonialism now in various forms. And so I suppose it's arguable that there's no difference between the two systems. But if you think of it very simply, the way, international bodies talk about it now, it's basically, is there an extreme form of exploitation, and are individuals kept in that system through coercion? And when you look at some of the most endemic problems in the world, both these things exist, which is why The data says there are more than 50 million people on any given day who are in modern slavery, right? So this could be things like, broadly they're classified as forced labor and forced marriage, broadly. And forced labor is so many different things. So in South Asia, we're really familiar with bonded labor, like a descent based form of slavery, where you have to work for someone, usually without wages, usually you're paid in kind, usually you're repaying debt. There's been recent work about how there's been forced labor in the sugarcane sector, and we know of various forms of forced labor in coffee and plantations in the Amazon. We know of forced labor in the seafood sector in Indonesia, Thailand, Taiwan, right, where workers are on boats for a long period of time, don't get proper food, don't get proper wages, very rarely have a contract. We know all this now. So, and the range of forced labor is huge, 27 million people probably in forced labor. And I'm sure that's like an underestimation of that number. And then forced marriages, where, I mean, child marriage is part of that, but also where marriage is used as a way to imprison almost women, or abuse them in various ways. Usually, when people think about modern slavery and trafficking, the first thing they think of is sex trafficking, right? So the use of human bodies for sex slavery, and that's very often children, very often women, but also men. But the one thing that the one thing that we know now and that we can't kind of shirk from is that modern crises are feeding into this, right? So the climate crisis and conflicts, global conflicts, what the first thing that they do is that they make people vulnerable to exploitation, because people get desperate to leave, people get desperate for an alternative. And in that desperation, then you go in for jobs or opportunities that otherwise you would check out,
Yeah.
or you would check your with your network, and you just don't. Like, you're desperate to get your child out of a conflict situation, you would send your child with someone who says, they'll get an education elsewhere. And that's like the first step in a trafficking journey, basically. So again, these are long answers, but none of them is so complicated that we can't understand, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned about hotspots and how Freedom Fund identifies the hotspots for slave-related issues. Can you explain how that model works? And
Yeah, maybe it'll be good to if I try and use a couple of examples of how it works. So, for instance, in Nepal, there has been until recently a form of bonded labor that's called the Harwa Charwa, right? This is where it's a sub community among the Dalits in Nepal, and it's where a group of people has basically been bonded to landowners for a long time, and they graze the cattle and they plow the land. And they used to be, until recently, paid in paddy, not even in rice, but they would get paddy, which they then had to take and get milled in order to be able to get rice to eat. It's been a there's been a series of movements in Nepal of former bonded laborers, and the Harwa Charwa have been one of the last to be declared free by the government. So when we started this work, they were not, on paper they were not free, and in reality, well, obviously not. And so we started by working with clusters of organizations in the southeast of Nepal, which is one of the places where there's the most number of Harwa Charwa. And basically, over the years, all these partners worked on mobilizing the Harwa Charwa into groups, sharing information about legal rights, supporting them with legal cases, which is such an important part of the work. Supporting their children in school, addressing discrimination in school, and all they were. It's like five different partners, all doing a different part of this work. And over time, what happened is that because they had done the work in this particular area in Madhesh province for quite a long time, they got a momentum going, and a group of the community got together, and they formed what was called the Harwa Charwa network.
yeah,
And they have now registered that network, and now that network is what negotiates with the government for whatever it is that the community wants. But the interesting thing is that all these years of work and the sustained pressure and the sustained visibility that all these partners brought to this issue resulted in the Prime Minister declaring this community free, legally free, in July of 2022. And all of us know that both means everything and nothing, right? It means everything in the sense that it's a huge historic moment. But also, it's also now the beginning of another kind of struggle where then freedom has to become actualized in real life. And then that's what the struggle is now. But now that struggle is not led by is sorry now that struggle is led by the community with other people in the background, like supporting them, but it's led by members of the community. So over time, the hotspot has managed to go from being a cluster of civil society organizations working for vulnerable community members to now being led by those community members who are easily are now able to speak with those in power. I think all this only happens because you invest over a long time in the same set of people on the same problem, and you back them to do the work that they know best how to do. I think that kind of trust and kind of almost like a not a guarantee but a kind of reassurance, I think that's very important for civil society, and it enables them to do their best work. And then also over a period of time, the local stakeholders, right, power holders, begin to see this as a unit which is more than just one person. And I think
Yeah.
that makes a big difference as well. So you're creating layers of change right from from right at the bottom, I think, to right at the top. And that's how the model works. And that's why I think it's so successful.
So hotspots are area where there are bodies who are already working and active, and you help them or empower their work further to get more tangible outcomes quicker. Is that understanding fair or correct?
Yes. Hotspots are, sorry, I should say it clearly. So, hotspots are areas where there is a high prevalence of a certain kind of problem,
Okay.
where we identify civil society partners who do interventions which will have an impact on that problem. They may not be working on that problem right now,
Yeah.
but they
Okay.
have a solution and they know that solution and they know the community.
Got it.
And because they knew the solution and because they're credible in the community, we convene them around the problem and
Got
then
it.
coordinate that effort so that over time we are able to reduce the prevalence of slavery.
I'm given the background that I am from, I'm unable to understand how a community cannot be free. So, can you help me understand that? Do they have an identity in the records, or I mean, so what is? I mean, how can a community be declared free? I'm just unable to understand that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a series of things. For example, some people will not have citizenship documents, right? Some people will not have birth registration. Almost everyone is, like I said, not going to school. Almost no one from that community goes to secondary school. But the core part of that lack of freedom, or the unfreedom, if you like, over there, is that they did not have the option to leave their work and seek other work. They were bonded to the local landowner. That's where the bondage was happening, and that bondage was happening across generations. So it's a form of bonded labor that I know that has been common in India as well. Now, because so they're seen as property of that landowner, right? And this is as close as you can get to the earlier form of slavery as possible. Now these people are not seen as the property of that landowner. The landowner does not have sole right over them, at least on paper. And now the community is in the process of changing that, and their first demand, actually, if you speak to that community, their first demand is give us the land, because that's what has tied them to somebody else all this time. So for them, the most important thing is to have land in their name so that they can then break that cycle of dependence.
And of course, much more hand holding because they are not used to this, right? I mean, they have to build. I mean, if education has not been available to them, I mean, there has to be somebody who is going to handhold them in this journey. It's going to, so usually how long does it take for them to settle with everybody else, or maybe close to par? Yeah.
No, I don't know the answer to how long it is, how long, but I'll say this: the the community does not need hand holding. They know
Okay.
very well what they want. They're very clear, and their leadership is extraordinary. They have a very democratic way of electing a group of people. That group of people is accountable to the wider community. They've got all this set up. It's a wonderful movement. So they don't need the hand holding. What they need is support with getting people in power to keep hearing them. And they need people in power to now do what they're supposed to do, right? So for example, one of the most important things that's happening right now, and since we're talking about Nepal, we'll
Yeah.
just take that example further. One of the most important thing that's happening right now is that guidelines have been issued to provincial governments on how to collect data about the harwa charwa, so that when the rehabilitation package is announced, all those who are harwa charwa get the rehabilitation package, right? That guideline is a historic guideline, and it's only been released because the community has you know continued to have conversations with the local government. But
Mm.
sometimes, so they have a conversation and they go back to their villages, right? Now, in the headquarters, you need someone to keep following up on that. So part of our partner team will keep following up on that for them, right? So this is the kind of support the community
Right.
needs. They don't Their ambitions and their pathway and all of that is super clear to them. What they need is resource, they need support of other kinds, they need allyship, and they need the system to respond. And of course, a large part of this is just, on the other side, of course, what you're saying is right, that for a you'll need to invest. There has to be an investment in the secondary and higher education of young people, so that there is a dream and an aspiration that can be actualized for a community that's never been given that space before. So in that sense, yes, that support is required for the community, at least I'd say for 10 or 20 years.
Something which many of us are familiar with is forced labor and child exploitation. So, how do you tackle something like this at a community level?
Almost the only meaningful place to tackle it is at the community level. But I'll start out by saying that yesterday, a colleague of mine reminded us that one of the SDGs had a target to end child labor, all forms of child labor, by 2025, and we've missed that target by 130 million plus. And she reminded us all of this, and I thought that that's quite telling, right? That even a problem that all of us should basically agree on, that children should not be working at the cost of their education, even that we have not been able to address globally, in like this is the 21st century. I think for us, how to address child labor or any kind of child exploitation again starts from who's identifying it as a problem, and is it a symptom of something else, or is it a problem in itself? So for instance, when in we are finding right now, we're just exploring work in Uganda, and we're finding right now that as a result of decades of drought in particular areas and decades of civil conflict of another kind, there has been a very high proportion of young girls getting married, and lots very high proportion of children getting trafficked across the border into Kenya's western counties and then onwards to Nairobi in order to do child domestic work. And when you go in to speak with people first, the first thing that they will say is that these children's them that their parents don't take care of them, and the mother is to blame, etc., etc. The mother is lazy, that's why she makes her child work, blah blah blah. And then you ask a little deeper, or you get into this a little bit deeper, and you realize these are families that have been pushed into desperation by drought, whose land is now either taken away or utterly barren, utterly good for nothing. With They have not had an education, they have not had any alternative skilling over the years. And very very often, because we're talking Kenya, so there's also been, we forget now that it was that part of the continent was racked by AIDS for a very long time. There are still families that have been you know broken due to the due to either somebody being impacted by AIDS themselves, or just to the indebtedness, or the lack of wage in the family, things like that, so many things. So you have very households which are headed by very young mothers sometimes, and yes, they're hardened and they're bitter and everything else, but I don't understand how that's the child's problem or that young mother's problem. I don't see that that's the case. So anyway, so sorry, what I was saying was that the child exploitation is resulting from something else, which is systemic, which is beyond the individual's control, right? So once you understand that, I think then you understand that the community is not the problem. It's, we say things like mindsets of people have to change. And yes, of course, they do have to change, right? There's no denying that. But that's not the major problem. The major problem is a system that pushes you into desperation and then you cope in various ways. And that coping then results in, the most vulnerable bearing the biggest load, right? So the women bear the biggest load, the vulnerable men bear the biggest load, and children bear the biggest load. That's what happens. So the system has pushed you into that. And I just wanted to explain that because I feel like it's so easy for us to make this about a problem about individuals and or about communities' lack of awareness. And I often find that that's not the case. The problem is not at that level. The problem is somewhere else. It's been pushed down to this level, right? And the price is being paid by people at the bottom of the hierarchy, if you like. We've found really that there are some really concrete ways of engaging with child exploitation at the community level, which is just to bring people together in groups and have conversations about basic children's rights, basic human rights, what they would want for their child, why they're not able to give their child that kind of thing, and work the conversation up from there. And in hotspot after hotspot, we have found that that kind of work with community groups is hugely successful. Some of it involves sharing information, some of it involves creating a space, some of it involves, giving people time to rest and think about things other than the emergency needs. Sometimes you have to alleviate the emergency need by providing something in the initially, but fundamentally it's about bringing people together and enabling them to share their views on a particular thing along with some supported information and things like that. And then we find, in Ethiopia, where we're talking about child domestic work, where children from other parts of Addis Ababa come in, like, sorry, they come in from around Addis to the capital and then work very often in the households of their relatives or of other people, sometimes paid, sometimes not paid. And very often, people will say, she's so much better off here. And then that will become an excuse to treat that child in any which way you want, right? And very
Yeah.
often in very humiliating ways, deprivation of sleep, deprivation of quality food, that's just almost standard. But even there is scope to bring people together and have a conversation and say, well, do you realize she's 12 or do you realize she's 13? And then somebody will say, oh, you don't know this community, they've got a lot of strength, she looks 12 but she's actually 16, things like that. So then you have to break that down, right, in conversations. And I should say this, right, I'm saying you have to do this, but this is not work that the Freedom Fund does. This is work that our partners do.
Yeah.
And these are partners who are hugely trusted by the community because they've been in those communities for so many years. And that's why they can have that conversation. So, sorry, just to say, just to wrap up, I know I'm going on about this for a bit, but just to say that the reason that the pressure is on community, or the reason that the community is the person who will make the change, is that that's the only thing that will last. Your government will come and go, right? Your policy
Yeah.
changes. We've seen this time and time again. But the relationships and the networks that you build in communities and these changes that you enable there, those are the things that basically make things better for children in the community.
Could you share some example where clustered investments have led to shifts either in policies or practices?
Yeah, again, the problem with this is that there are so many. But let me maybe share an example from, let's say, Brazil, where the commercial sexual exploitation of girls is just rife in the northeast of Brazil, in Recife, where we have a hotspot. So started the intervention there about 5 years ago. We've invested systematically in about 10 partners over the last 5 or 6 years, invested in some research because we there's always been quite a strong movement in that part of the country, but equally that movement had gone through a bit of a, a low phase and wasn't very, active. and the government, the local government, didn't have any data on what we call CSEC, the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And so was saying things like, it's been addressed, it's solved, etc., etc. So we invested money, did some research, established, a really rigorous number that people can respond to. So 1 in 6 girls in Recife has had transactional sex before the age of 17, at least once. That's a staggering figure. And over time, so we were at a point where the government wasn't even acknowledging this was a problem. We used the data to convince them it's a problem. They set up a working group. All the partners, all our 10 partners, have been working very closely both at the community level and with the government. There's all kinds of pressure building that's happened. And recently, they've the state of Pernambuco, which is the where Recife is located, that state has passed a 10-year action plan for the prevention of sexual violence against children and adolescents. So for me, that's just a classic example of how work at the ground over a sustained period of time has resulted not only in immediate benefits for communities, but also has enabled the government to set up, or to have a policy which will impact so many more children. I should say, this is not to say that that policy is only a result of this work, right? Obviously every single policy change is a result of many pieces of work,
Yeah.
but this is a significant contributor towards it. And I think, again, the idea that there's a cluster of organizations, they have an identity as a cluster that makes them stronger than their individual parts. The scale of their work is better because it's pulled together. The volume of the voice is louder. I think all of that counts in making policy change.
And when it comes to survivors of trafficking or forced labor, how do they get included in policy making? Or, like you did mention that they know the solutions, but policy making or changes in the system?
I think one example that I gave you was Nepal, right? Like where the
Yeah.
Harvachara basically now they are the people who are
Yeah.
interacting with the government. They're the people who are saying what they want in the rehabilitation policy, all of that. That's just a very clear example. And I'll say that across the world, there's just a lot of examples where people do this, kind of survivor led, survivor engaged, survivor inclusive kind of work, almost in a very organic kind of powerful way. And I just want to call out, for example, the work of Azadi Kenya, which is an extraordinary organization that demonstrates this. ASMA in Ethiopia, again, an organization led by a former domestic worker, exploited domestic worker. So there are a number of these organizations that demonstrate how to do this. I think it's very easy to tokenize this, right, Santosh? So it's very easy to say, oh, we're doing this policy, let's find a survivor quickly and bring them to
Yeah.
the table and include them, and like now our policy is survivor informed. It's not about that. And I think you have to accept that survivors, this a survivor as a category is not a homogeneous category. Survivors are men, they are women, they are children, they are informed by the language, the region, the all of that comes with them. So super important not to homogenize survivors. And two friends of mine keep talking about this, the fact that what we have to do at the policy table is not to necessarily to invite this one or that one in, but just to make that table bigger so that more people can participate. And so that's I sorry so that's just one part of it. In terms of how survivors inform policy, I think even in Kenya right now, we're trying to work with the to create some kind of momentum to ratify ILO conventions that recognize domestic work as work. And even there, it's the domestic worker advocates and domestic worker champions who are leading that conversation with the government. It's not, even now, even as we talk about it and even as there's more conversation about this, it doesn't happen as much as it should. But I think that there are enough examples across the world of it happening very strongly. And I'd say just one more thing on this. I don't want to lose out on this. I was in Indonesia recently, and I am struck by how workers mobilize across an industry which they're not in one physical space, right? In the seafood industry, which is what where our hotspot is on there, workers are on boats, right? So they go away to sea for a long time and they come back. And yet there are unions that bring, you know, workers together, and these workers work together to pressurize, let's say, local councils to have a wage council to determine how much minimum wage workers should get. And how I mean, it's for me quite striking how you have so little and yet you fight such a big battle, you know. And for you, obviously, people say this all the time, right? People who are impacted by problems say all the time, we don't have a choice to step back from this problem. This is our life. It's true, it is your life, but equally, I think it's hugely commendable. The leadership is hugely commendable, and the effort and the time that goes into it is hugely commendable. And they're all leading that work on their own, right? Or again, what they need is a bit of resource, they need a bit of support, they need a bit of structure. But again, the solutions are there, and they've done it themselves.
Since you worked with a lot of leaders, especially on such complex issues and and such situations, what have you seen that drives them, that to start and to sustain? One is to start and one is to sustain. I think it's like, how do they get the energy?
Where is the choice, right? Like, you know, I don't know, I mean, if you're a worker on a boat and you watch your friend, lose his arm, or you watch your friend fall over and nobody goes to rescue him, what's your choice? You will speak up, right? You will do something. You're compelled to action. Your circumstances compel you to action. I think I'm just thinking of some of the leaders that I have met. And yes, you're right. The energy is extraordinary. The will, the intelligence, all of that is extraordinary. And it's all driven by this core experience, right? That none that people like me, no matter how passionate I might be about a particular issue, my relationship to it is just different, right? And people say this all the time, like, if you don't want to do this job, you can move and go to another job, right? This was not your experience. If it was your experience, you would fight differently. And I think that's true. I acknowledge that. It's something that I've learned over the past few years. But also, again, in Indonesia, this is something that really moved me. People said to me things like, this leader, he's not just a face on a piece of paper, or on the internet or something like that. I don't know him. I don't just have his phone number. I know where he lives, right? I know his family. And that's why I trust him. So there's this real rooted network of relationships and this credibility on which this leadership is built, which I feel is something that we've kind of lost somewhere with other forms of mobilization, and it's still so alive in worker movements. I just find that super powerful and super inspiring.
And many of the work that we do in this space specifically, let's assume that you're seeing a goal and you're running towards it, but at times the gap between you and the goal is constant. But if you stop running, then it goes further away, correct? And this is like sustaining. So just to sustain, you have to keep running, even though the gap continues, right?
Yeah.
What are the biggest challenge, really, if you were to just pick a few of them to
The
manage
biggest
sustenance?
biggest challenge to sustain.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge to sustain is, sorry, I'm thinking about what what different people might say to that. The leaders that I have met. One is resource, right? Just resource to keep, it's fuel, right? Your resource is a fuel, and you need resource to get legal expertise, you need resource to get media expertise, or you need resource to write, to get an accountant, right? Part of it is just that basic. You need resource. And the one thing that these groups don't have is they have plenty of human resource, they have plenty of intellectual resource, but the capital of the world is held somewhere else. And so I think that we have to acknowledge that Everybody, we always talk about how we can do so much with so little money. It's absolutely true, and I absolutely admire it. But I also feel like it's the one biggest is the one biggest thing. If we can find the right movements and the right leaders and resource them in ways that sustain them for a period of time, I think we will reduce some of the pressure that they have. So that's one thing. But I think the other major challenge, or the other, is what people are calling the polycrisis environment, right? I think in you could say that every single survivor is right now dealing with so many things at the individual level, and a mountain load of crises that are trying to push them down even further, right? So it's like I said about Uganda, right? Which what are you going to solve? Are you going to address your hunger? Are you going to address the fact that you're exploited in labor? Are you going to address the fact that you're exploited sexually? Are you going to address the fact that there's drought? I don't know. There's all these things all pushing down on this, on a group of people. And I think that can be, if you start thinking about that, I think it can be very hard. And that's why many people, when they're doing this work, try not to think about it, right? You put one foot in front of the other and you go forward. But that's where I think the world has the biggest responsibility. Look at the drivers of slavery, the big drivers: crisis, climate, you know other things like that. And then make sure that anti-trafficking initiatives form part of humanitarian efforts in all these situations, so that you're not waiting for the trafficking to happen before you address it, so that you have protective mechanisms in place before it all happens.
You spoke about resources and Freedom Fund. You do mobilize resources across different stakeholders, and then you enable the frontline organizations. So, how do you balance the priorities of the funders, the policymakers, and the frontline organizations? How do you create that balance? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing like I said about survivors, right? Funders are not a homogeneous group. So you have there are funders that are like the most some of the most radical people I have met in the world, right? Radically people centered, radically aligned with the workers and with people who are oppressed. With them there's no challenge. It's a joy, right? You're just bringing together, you're a vehicle to bring together people from different, almost from different universes in a sense, but who all believe in the same thing. And that's magic when that happens. And I feel it more and more. It happens more and more as this young generation is brought up to understand what privilege is and what our responsibility is as young people. There are just more and more young people who understand the value of resource and who acknowledge it and who contribute in really meaningful ways. And for the rest, Santosh, where there is a difference, for the Freedom Fund, it's super clear. Our primary stakeholder are our communities. Our primary stakeholder is the partner. Those are the primary people that we believe in. And then it's the job of people like me and others in my organization to communicate why the primary stakeholder is the primary stakeholder. That's our job, to bring other people along and to share with donors how the ways in which we manage these partners mean that money will be managed responsibly, to demonstrate to them what impact can be with the beyond direct impact numbers, right? To show them that even beyond things that you can write in a report, like x number of people have been liberated or x number of people have accessed legal services, all of which is super important data. Beyond that, they're creating something which is sustained and not only just sustained but also like forward looking, right? Something which is looking forward into a future which is better. Once you show people that, then I don't think people are going to step away from this. They're going to come in with whatever they have, right? And you can say there should be more money in the sector, or you can say there should be, you know you know that there should be more responsiveness from certain people. Yes, there can always be, but in general I feel like, and this I felt particularly once I moved out of India, that there are a huge number of donors who are just waiting for the right opportunity to invest. Sometimes they feel embarrassed by the size of their donation, sometimes they feel embarrassed by the questions, Sometimes they just want to ask something, they don't feel safe to ask it, they feel they'll be judged because they're conscious of their privilege. It's these are problems we can address, right? So actually, I don't see too much now. I feel more hopeful now than I did, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago. I feel like the donor community is far more responsive, far more educated, far more invested in solving this problem than I like in the past. I didn't feel like that, but now I feel very convinced about it.
That's so nice to hear. You did mention about observing the supply chain and the impact of forced labor there. This what I mean, is it this profitability that is the reason for forced labor? That's one question. Second, from a business takeaway, what role can businesses really play to dismantling these systems?
Yeah, it's just profitability. There's no like I in my mind there's no doubt about it. It's profitability and who you think deserves profit, right? There's a supply chain of 10, like 10 levels of supply chain. You look at that 10 levels of the supply chain, you know where the concentration of profit is going to be. It's not rocket science, and
Yeah.
everybody knows this, right? So I mean, if everybody knows this and we're still not addressing it, then it's only not being addressed because there's very strong vested interests right at the top. So is the primary interest of in all this, are we going to start out by thinking about what should the shareholder get as dividend, or are we going to start by asking what's the minimum wage that everyone in this entire supply chain should be getting? It's like that's the question, right? You have to decide which question you're going to ask first and which question you're going to base everything on. I'll say one thing just on this, the amount of work that has happened on, on what corporations need to do to address forced labor in their supply chains is phenomenal. The number of experts that have brought their expertise to this issue is massive. The only reason it's not happening, I think, is that we're currently short of model corporations who will take this and advocate for it and make it their mission. It's one of those things that I really hope we're going to be able to do in the coming years. There's something called a Global Commission on Modern Slavery, which is headed currently by Theresa May. And one of the things that she and some of the commissioners on the group really want to do is this, because there are a couple of commissioners there who have been ex CEOs of large corporations, and what they really want to do is to introduce the conversation with CEOs of other multinationals. And I'm really hoping that that leads to some meaningful action. And I'll just say one thing that all corporations, if they wanted to, could start with, right? And that's worker led social audits, the audits which are done by KPMG, or I shouldn't say KPMG, it's any kind of third party auditor.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's there is evidence to say do worker led audits, let workers tell you about minimum wages, about forced labor in your supply chain, let them do the audit and come back to you. And again, on these they get you get to an agreement with corporations to some at some point, and then the legal team steps in and you move 5 paces back. So I think there is a little bit of a lack of collective of a lack of will right at the top, in that area. It's if we're only going to take responsibility for tier one of our supply chains, then we're not going to address forced labor because we know that it exists beyond tier one. And if we're going to contract it out and say, well, it's not my responsibility now, all this is not hidden, right? This is none
Yeah.
of this. This is in the model. So there's fundamentally something wrong with the model. And those who benefit most from that model will have to be the ones who will say, yes, okay, let's start by chipping away at this one thing. Chalo, I'll go from tier one to tier two and three. Start that. Now, I mean, as soon as they start that, this will change. The pattern of this problem will change.
I know this is a tough question, but I'm still going to ask. Is there one takeaway that you want to leave in here for the audience, which will help a shift in the society to end modern day slavery?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the same thing that, again, other people have said, and Audre Lorde has said it in a different context, right? So no one is free until everyone is free. That's just the truth of it. And we can hide our heads in the sand, but at some point all of us confront it in our lives. And at whichever point we confront it in our lives, that's not too late to start acting. And I always say, you don't have to you don't need a big platform, right? You find your local organization and you contribute to your local organization. You can't contribute $1,000, no problem. Contribute 10, no problem, right? There's always time to begin acting, but you act on that as soon as you realize and as soon as you feel that this is about everybody, and it's about a planet. It's about probably the most promising race in the universe. It's a big thing, right? You can show up for it. Surely you can show up for it. So I just feel like if we all just remember that this is a struggle for everyone, not for somebody else out there who's not me, then if we acknowledge that, then this will change.
True. There's this quote by Martin Luther King which says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice."
Yeah,
So, yeah, I think hope is what will drive us. So, thank you so much, Havovi, for this conversation. But we need to know you a little more through a rapid fire. So, are you ready for that?
go for it.
Okay. So, let's see if the priorities continue even after you have shifted from India. Chai or coffee?
No, no, tea,
Tea.
chai.
Okay. Chai. Super. A
Yeah.
book that has changed the way you think.
I thought about this question for a long time. Can I please name three books? I really want to plug three books.
Sure.
So the first one is this book called The Left Hand of Darkness, which is by Ursula Le Guin, which is a fantasy fiction, which changed my life completely because it showed me it's about, I think at the core, it's about the power of friendship. It's a beautiful book, which I strongly recommend. And I recently read a book that a friend of mine recommended by Imbolo Mbui called How Beautiful We Were, which is a story about a small village in Africa, in the African continent, and how a big oil company changes that way of life and what happens. It's a beautiful, very evocative story. And then the third book, which is like, I almost feel right now, almost supersedes the other two for me, which is really difficult, is a book called James by Percival Everett. It's a rewriting of Huckleberry Finn, but this time it's written from the point of view of the person who's called Jim in Huck Finn, but whose name is actually James. And the end of that book of James is a reminder to us all of what of 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 how change might happen.
One word friends would use to describe you.
Happy.
If you weren't in the social development sector, what would you be doing?
I would teach.
Your hope for the next generation of women leaders.
I hope that we will have a generation of women leaders that will lead with joy, really resting in their confident in themselves and in each other, and able to bring people together and really who have the capacity to enjoy the journey and help other people to enjoy the journey.
Lovely. However, lovely talking to you as always. And thank you for sharing your journey and insights.
Thanks.
I'm really hoping that, ending modern day slavery is possible when all the survivor voices are heard and all the work that you do will translate to meaningful impact on is already translating, and more power to all that you do. Thank you so much for bringing the perspective on the Her Story conversation. Really love
Thanks,
speaking to
Santosh,
you.
for having me.